Sometimes people ask questions like, do you think melee weapons will ever make a comeback and rival firearms? I mean, some kind of sci-fi scenario, whether it be like Dune or Star Trek even, or Star Wars. And that makes me kind of think, for one, I'm just going to give you a quick answer. I think when it comes to firearms, Pandora's box has been opened. I don't really think there's a way to go back. I mean, you never know. Like, it's impossible to predict the future. But I can't really imagine that would be the case. I feel like any further development in weapon technology will be along the path of ranged weapons. You know, whether it be firearms in the sense of gunpowder, or rail guns, or lasers, or whatever. Musing about various what-if scenarios in history is always interesting. And in fact, it's a fascinating topic overall, even in fiction, as seen by Marvel's What If, the newest Dragon Ball game, where you can play what-if scenarios like, you know, what if Vegeta had become Super Saiyan on Namek? It's always fun to think about. And so, when it comes to history, of course, there's no way to know for sure. The further you go back in history, if you change anything, the more it's going to ripple all throughout the timeline. But I do have to wonder if certain things are inevitable, like war. It seems to be almost hard-coded into our DNA, and not really. The prevailing theory is that war came about by becoming sedentary, you know, agriculture. Because before that, when you had roaming hunter-gatherers, there was no reason to fight on a large scale. You may have smaller melees. You know, people would absolutely fight, of course, and you may have groups opposing one another. But if you just move along anyway, there's not as much of a reason to fight each other over resources. Whereas if you own land, like the idea of land ownership in and of itself precedes warfare, because now you have territory. And if you have territory, there's the option to take more of it by force. So, and of course, hierarchy. It seems that hunter-gatherer societies are egalitarian generally, and with the advent of agriculture, you get the stratification and specialization, where not everybody does everything or can do everything, more or less. Now you have specialists, and some roles are ranked more highly than others, and you have leaders in charge of distributing resources. So then if you have a hierarchy and territory, is war inevitable? Whether as humans we are hierarchical by nature is another question, because as I said, hunter-gatherers tend not to be. But maybe it's in our DNA to become hierarchical as soon as we settle down. Either way, so if war is inevitable, are certain developments in weapons technology inevitable? And considering how early gunpowder or black powder was invented in China and then adapted for use in firearms. I know I've mentioned it before, but I can't remember on top of my head the exact date for the earliest evidence of a firearm in Europe.
The earliest known visual depiction of a firearm is from 1326, and the oldest surviving firearm is from 1340.
That's really quite early. You know, at that point, they weren't all that common. You know, early handguns were rather primitive and not that effective. Anyway, so the question is, if firearms hadn't been invented at that time, would it have happened later? For example, during the Age of Exploration, or perhaps later. And I'm thinking probably yes. Humans have always had this drive to invent more weapons, and specifically ranged weapons. There's this meme picture of a medieval painting of a man that says, I want to stab this guy, but he's all the way over there. They did that very early on, obviously. The atlatl is very old, the bow is, and other things, thrown weapons and various projectiles. So I feel like it was only a matter of time until someone discovers some form of explosive material and then figures out, hey, if you ignite that in a barrel, in a metal tube, you can launch a projectile. At the very latest, when chemistry emerged, and when people started to experiment with all kinds of materials, see what sort of reactions happen if you put this together or if you light that on fire and all that. I think at the very least then, they would have discovered black powder or some form of explosive. So I'm pretty sure sooner or later someone would have figured out, hey, if we can make this stuff explode, what if we put it in a confined space, make it explode? Maybe they would have invented grenades first and bombs, and then firearms. So maybe we've always been on that path. And I do think we'll stay on that path unless something radically changes, like some form of new technology. That's what I like about the Dune shields. It's a great idea. It's a good idea for how this might happen. Could there be some kind of technology that makes firearms obsolete, or that gives melee weapons the edge, no pun intended, or a form of defense that works against firearms but that can be circumvented by melee weapons? The other question is, were swords inevitable? And I'm leaning towards saying yes as well. Not everywhere, obviously. I mean, some parts of the world never saw the development of swords. That has to do with access to resources. Assuming the resources are there, assuming people discover metals on the surface and learn how to process ores and make bronze and iron and all that. Assuming that, are swords inevitable? I feel like yes, because what's a sword? A longer dagger, right? I made a joke about that a while ago. Make it longer. If you have metal daggers, you have swords. It's just a matter of making them longer. So a sword in and of itself, I think, is pretty much inevitable as a weapon in history. As long as you have metal. If you don't have metal, that changes everything in history. I mean, if there were no metals at that point, what would people have? I mean, probably something like makohit and shark tooth swords and all of that. They would just combine an organic core with various materials. Obviously, the most inevitable weapon is a club. You just pick up a piece of wood. You just pick up a branch, you got a club. Okay. So it's very intuitive and obvious to go from. Followed by a spear. You know, put some sharp material at the end of a stick, or even more primitive, just sharpen a stick. Okay, there you go. So that would always happen. Axes, yeah, you know, tie a sharp rock to a stick. Okay, you got an axe. That's also very obvious. Swords would take longer, but I do think they're probably just about as inevitable with metal. Could there be a parallel Earth in which ranged weapons don't exist? I don't think so. They were invented just about everywhere. And where you didn't have bows, you had atlatls, spear throwers. So some form of ranged weapon existed everywhere. So I don't think you can have an Earth with humans without ranged weapons, which is why I'm thinking that guns would have been only a matter of time as well. Now, a world without weapons and war, that'd be different. Then I wouldn't have that topic to nerd out about. I'd be nerding out about other things, but yeah. Better world, right? Obviously. Well, I mean, you can always make the argument that warfare has led to some inventions. Aggressive competition drives innovation. There's that. I don't think it's worth the horrors of war Question is, would humans use other ways to hurt each other? You know, if not war, then, I mean, you could have violence without war, right? You could still have murder and whatnot without organized warfare, of course. And there could still be scammers and thieves and all of that. Anyway, the other thing that I think is inevitable is armor. I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? If you have offensive tools, you need defensive tools as well. I mean, you don't absolutely need them, but it's kind of obvious. It's easy to forget that Native Americans had armor. It's not usually represented because during the time frame that we think of, you know, after the arrival of Europeans, they pretty soon ditched the armor because they found that it doesn't do anything against European guns, right? But they had them. So there are a lot of parts of the world that had some form of armor. And I don't think, I can imagine a parallel Earth that has weapons that doesn't have armor. Anyway, I've blabbered enough, and it's getting cold out here. I'm just gonna finish this. But I'm curious to know what you think. Which arms and armor in history do you think might be inevitable? What kind of developments? Do you think there could be a world without war? A world in which there are humans. Obviously, there could be a parallel Earth where humans never evolved. Thus, there is no war. But could you imagine? I mean, it's possible that, of course, if humans had stayed hunter-gatherers and hadn't gone through this, you know, stratification, hierarchy and territory and all that, yeah, sure. But other than that, what do you think? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and stay safe from all the human-made dangers of the world, I guess. He says while filling his mouth with a carcinogen.